How far would you go for the perfect body? My culture had one rule: the smaller a woman's feet, the more valuable she is. So my dad took it upon himself to make sure all his daughters, including me, had perfectly bound lotus feet. 3-inch golden lotuses were the ideal, and anything larger was grotesque. He'd measure us daily with a special golden ruler, and if our feet showed signs of growing despite the bindings, he'd break them again himself. Dad had always obsessed over feminine perfection. He'd measure mom's feet monthly, disappointed they were 4 inches despite being bound since childhood. He made her wear tiny embroidered shoes that barely contained her folded feet, saying, "A beautiful woman suffers silently for her elegance." He collected hundreds of these shoes, displaying them in glass cases like precious jewels. When I turned 5, he started my binding, promising I'd be the most beautiful daughter with the tiniest feet anyone had ever seen. I still remember that first night, the sound of my own bones cracking, my childish voice begging him to stop, the way he smiled and said this was love. Mom never defended us. She'd been praised for her lotus gait as a young bride, that swaying walk that men found so alluring, never mentioning it came from bones folded in half. Her own mother had bound her feet at age 3, and she'd won beauty contests in her village before marrying Dad. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at her own mangled feet with tears in her eyes, but she'd quickly look away. When my sister Mei Ling turned 6, Dad measured her feet and flew into a rage. They were already too big. "No man will want a wife with peasant feet," he screamed. He hired a professional footbinder, an old woman who specialized in late corrections, breaking and rebinding feet that had grown too much. She brought special binding cloth soaked in herbs and animal blood, following ancient recipes. Mei Ling screamed for 3 days straight as the woman folded her feet tighter and tighter, Dad reminding her that beauty requires sacrifice. I held her hand through it all, both of us sobbing, her fingernails digging into my palm as each bone snapped. Living in that house meant constant measurement and comparison. Dad kept charts of our foot sizes, celebrating each lost millimeter. My feet shrank from breaking and binding until they were barely 3 inches. Dad threw a party saying I'd achieved golden lotus perfection. But the smaller they got, the more excruciating life became. Walking on feet folded completely in half, toes tucked under, bones grinding against each other with each step. Dad would parade us before his friends, making us remove our shoes so they could admire our tiny feet. They'd nod approvingly, saying we'd make fine wives, that our husbands would treasure such perfect lotus feet. One man offered to arrange my marriage to his son, impressed that at 14, my feet were smaller than a child's shoe. I wanted to scream that I was a child, that these weren't feet anymore but mangled stumps, but I just smiled through the tears, because speaking up meant more binding. The binding process never stopped. Every few days, Dad would inspect and retighten, breaking any new bone growth. He'd measure obsessively. Mei Ling's feet had stopped at 4 inches, and he considered her a failure. Mine were approaching 2.5 inches, bones so compressed they were fusing together. Dad said I was his masterpiece. We competed in local lotus feet contests, where fathers would display their daughters' tiny feet. Dad would oil my feet until they shone, dress them in silk shoes the size of doll accessories. Judges would measure and examine, praising the arch, the fold, the way my toes had completely disappeared under the foot. I won every time, Dad glowing with pride while I stood trembling from pain. Each trophy felt like a monument to my torture. The infection started when I was 15. The folds were so deep, so compressed, that flesh began to rot between the layers. But Dad said the smell was the perfume of beauty, and bound them tighter to hide the decay. Mei Ling developed blood poisoning, her feet turning black, but Dad just worried it would make them look larger. One day, I collapsed at another beauty contest. The infection had reached my bloodstream. When the judges tried to help, they unwrapped my feet and recoiled. Beneath the silk was rotting flesh, bones protruding through skin, toes that had necrotized completely. What they'd been judging as perfect golden lotuses were literally dying appendages. The hospital had to amputate both feet below the ankles. They said another week and I would have died from sepsis. Mei Ling lost most of her toes. They found Mom's feet were similarly infected after decades in tiny shoes. Dad tried to convince the doctors this was about preserving beauty traditions, that we'd be worthless women without our lotus feet. Even as I lay there with no feet at all, he wept not for my pain, but because I'd lost my beauty. He actually asked the doctors if they could bind my prosthetics. The court was horrified. Dad had turned an extinct practice into modern child torture, all for his obsession with an ancient beauty standard. He destroyed his daughters' bodies for the sake of 3-inch feet, and I was ready to make sure he'd never walk again. Full story on channel, link below.